The story of Gehrman, the first hunter, cannot begin with him alone. To understand his path, we must first step into the world that shaped him, a world unlike our own, yet curiously familiar in its shadows. Yharnam, the city of the hunt, does not greet strangers with welcome or warmth. Instead, it greets with mist. A pale haze lingers always at its thresholds, clinging to cobblestones, gathering in the mouths of alleyways, settling upon towers whose bells toll endlessly through the night. The mist is not merely weather, it feels older, almost alive. It softens every edge, swallows every distance, and makes the familiar uncanny. By its veil, Yharnam exists suspended between dream and waking, between the mortal and the unfathomable. Even at its brightest hours, the city is never fully daylit. Lanterns must always be lit. Windows are forever shuttered. It is as though Yharnam knows the sun, but has long since forgotten how to bask in it. Within this fog-bound city, blood reigns as both doctrine and desire. To outsiders, Yharnam is famed for its miraculous healing blood, a sacrament said to cure illness, mend wounds, and grant strength where none remained. Pilgrims come from across distant lands to partake, bringing their sicknesses, their frailty, their hope. They leave changed. Some leave mended, walking with newfound vigor. Others are never seen again. This is the paradox that lies at the heart of Yharnam, salvation and damnation drawn from the same vial. The blood is worshipped, studied, guarded as sacred truth, yet every blessing it grants is paired with shadow. For every soul healed, another is twisted. For every cure, a curse is sown. The people know this, they whisper of it, yet still they come. For in a world shrouded in mist and silence, even cursed salvation is preferable to none at all. It is here that the hunt begins, not as tradition, not as glory, but as necessity. The city's reliance on blood ensures its survival, yet that same blood spawns horrors. Men and women, once human, begin to change. Their bodies grow furred, their jaws lengthen, their hands curl into claws. What begins as fever ends as bestial scourge. When night falls, the sound of these creatures echoes through the narrow streets. Roars mingle with bells, claws scratch upon stone, and every door is barred against what prowls outside. The hunt is the city's answer to this curse. Hunters, armed with cruelly efficient weapons, walk the misted alleys in vigil. To the common folk, they are saviors, wielders of swords and blades that keep the beasts at bay. But to the hunters themselves, the work is burden more than honor. Each night is long. Each hunt claims lives. For in striking down beasts, hunters see not only monsters, but neighbors, kin, and strangers who once came seeking cure. Yharnam breathes through this paradox, a city whose salvation demands sacrifice, a people who embrace blood even as it dooms them, and hunters who become executioners against their will. The cycle repeats without end. The bells toll, the blood flows, the beasts rise, and the hunters answer. The city itself reflects this endlessness. Its architecture climbs like a labyrinth, streets folding into streets, alleys doubling back upon themselves. Towers rise impossibly high, their spires piercing clouds that never part. Stairs climb endlessly upward, while beneath them catacombs sink deeper and deeper, winding toward forgotten tombs. Yharnam is not built as one city, but as many piled atop each other, each layer pressing down upon the next. In such a place, time feels blurred. Past, present, and future seem less like sequence and more like overlay. To walk its streets is to walk upon centuries at once. In this setting, hunters are not merely soldiers. They are part of the ritual structure itself, woven into the city's being. Each hunt, though bloodied, is almost liturgical. Torches carried like processional candles, bells tolling like church chimes, beasts cut down as though in grim sacrifice. The hunt is not simply a battle, it is a rite that sustains Yharnam, a grim pageant of salvation bought by slaughter. Here, in the silence of lamplit streets, we begin to glimpse the paradox that will define Gehrman's life. For his story cannot be told apart from Yharnam's. He is both child of its streets and servant of its curse. He did not seek to become a figure of legend, nor did he aspire to lead. He was drawn, as all hunters were, into necessity. Yet because of that necessity, he became the first to shape the hunt, and the one most deeply bound to its fate. But before we can follow Gehrman himself, we must linger a little longer upon the atmosphere that shaped him, for the world around him is not passive background. It is actor, stage, and chorus alike. The mist of Yharnam quiets every footfall, making even the brave feel alone. The lamps burn, fragile points of warmth in endless dark. And the tolling bells, never ceasing, remind all that the hunt is eternal. Imagine then, a night in Yharnam. The air hangs heavy, damp with fog. Doors are bolted, windows dark. From the shadows comes a sound, a low growl rising into a howl. Somewhere in the distance, a lantern flares, then sputters. A hunter steps forth, sword in hand, coat drawn against the chill, knowing the night will be long. That hunter could be any, and yet in time, one would be remembered above all. Gehrman. It is within this misted silence that his footsteps first echoed. Before he was called first hunter, before the dream claimed him, before the moon itself bent to bind him, Gehrman walked these streets as a man. And like all men of Yharnam, he was shaped by blood, by duty, and by the endless tolling of bells that signaled another night of the hunt. Thus, our journey begins not with triumph, but with atmosphere, not with revelation, but with tone. Yharnam itself is our first teacher, and through its stillness we prepare to trace Gehrman's path, for his story is one of paradox, artistry and violence, freedom and captivity, salvation and damnation. It is a story born of a city shrouded in pale mist, and from that mist, the figure of one man will emerge. The sun had dipped below the ragged horizon of the New Mexico desert, leaving the town of Las Cruces swaddled in twilight. The mesquite and juniper trees along the edges of the Withers family plot, bent in the hot, restless wind, their shadows stretching like crooked fingers across the sandy earth. By nightfall, the graveyard was a place where silence had weight, where the air itself seemed to press down on anyone foolish enough to linger too long. And yet, in 1856, linger they did. The Withers family burial ground was already infamous. Word had spread of coffins being unearthed, of bodies laid to rest that would not stay buried. The tale had begun with the first child, a daughter, young Martha Withers, whose small pine box had been lifted from the soil barely 3 days after her interment. The townsfolk swore it had been the coyotes, or perhaps grave robbers, but the tracks around the disturbed mound told no tale of claws or boots. The soil had been pushed outward from within, as though the coffin itself had clawed its way up. Her father, Elias Withers, a stern man whose faith was worn like iron, ordered the child buried again, deeper, in a coffin bound with chains. But still, the ground gave her back. By the time of the second child's burial, fear had already taken root in Las Cruces. Families crossed the street to avoid passing the Withers home. Women clutched their rosaries when Elias appeared in the market, muttering prayers beneath their breath. The town preacher had even suggested quietly that perhaps the Withers bloodline was cursed, though he stopped short of saying it aloud from the pulpit. It was on the third exhumation, though, that whispers grew into something darker. One moonless night, a ranch hand named Samuel Dyer had been riding back from the southern fields when he passed near the cemetery. He swore he saw movement, small figures, pale and unsteady, wandering among the headstones, too large for coyotes, too strange for men. Their heads lolled, their steps dragged, as though they were walking with bodies that had forgotten how to be alive. Samuel galloped hard back into town, his horse foaming, his eyes wild with terror. He told anyone who would listen that the children had risen, that he saw their eyes shining in the starlight, empty but awake. Some dismissed him, others cursed him for spreading lies, but in their hearts, fear took deeper root. The Withers burial ground became a place no one entered willingly after dusk, but Elias Withers would not yield to rumor. Grief had carved lines into his face, but pride stiffened his spine. Each time a child was returned to the surface of the earth, he ordered them reburied. He hired stronger men, dug deeper holes, reinforced coffins with iron nails, chains, even blessed soil, scattered at the bottom of each grave. And still, the earth rejected them. 13 times in total. 13 small coffins unearthed. 13 children who, in death, seemed unwilling to stay where they had been placed. By the 7th reburial, the town had turned against Elias completely. They said the family's land was poisoned, that Elias had trafficked with things best left unspoken, that the children were not truly dead but belonged to something older, something that demanded their restless wandering. And always the graveyard remained silent until night fell and the desert winds carried whispers no man could name. Old women claimed they heard laughter drifting from the stones, not the laughter of joy, but the brittle tittering of children playing games that had no warmth. Others swore they saw small handprints pressed into the dirt outside the fence, as though something had tried to crawl out and away from the graves, but was always drawn back. By now, no one doubted Samuel Dyer's account. The sheriff refused to post men near the graveyard. The preacher would not bless the ground. And Elias, who had once been a pillar of his community, found himself shunned as a pariah. His grief hardened into anger, his anger into desperation. Still he returned, spade in hand, to dig, to bury, to curse, and to pray, but none of it mattered. For the children came back, and the graveyard whispered louder with each passing night. The town of Las Cruces would never again look upon the Withers family without dread. What began as rumor had become legend, and what lingered in the soil of that graveyard was something no one dared to name. But the truth was this: the Withers children were not simply victims of a curse. They were heralds of something far older than the town, older than New Mexico, older even than the desert itself. And the desert never forgets. By the early months of 1857, the Withers family graveyard had become a place of hushed dread. The first whispers of unnatural activity, exhumed coffins, children returned to the surface, had spread through Las Cruces like dry grass catching fire. At first, the townsfolk tried to rationalize: coyotes, errant winds, the shifting of earth. But as each successive burial failed, the rational explanations began to crumble. There were too many anomalies, too many consistent patterns to dismiss. Fear, once whispered behind shutters and drawn curtains, began to ripple outward, growing in volume and intensity. The children had been reburied, chained and nailed in pine, laid in graves of unusual depth. Yet each morning, Elias Withers would return to find the soil disturbed, the coffins displaced, the children again at the surface. The evidence was undeniable, and it terrified the town to its core. A single event solidified the hysteria. One particularly dark night, the town blacksmith, Tomas Alvarez, claimed to have witnessed movement inside the largest of the Withers family graves. Riding past the cemetery, with his lantern swinging, he saw small figures slip from the earth as though gravity itself refused to hold them. Their faces were pale and hollow, their eyes reflecting nothing but the dim light of the stars above. Shocked, he fled, screaming for help, and in his panic, the lantern fell and shattered, casting the night into complete darkness. Word spread quickly. The town erupted in speculation, rumor, and superstition. People claimed they saw shadowy forms darting between the graves or heard soft laughter echoing across the dunes. Some said the children were cursed, others that Elias had angered some ancient power, a desert spirit or otherworldly entity whose attention had been drawn to the family plot. Fear became contagious, moving like a quiet wind through every household, growing stronger each day. By this point, even the local preacher could no longer dismiss the matter. His sermons, once focused on salvation and divine grace, began to contain veiled warnings, urging congregants to pray for protection, for the Withers children and for the town itself. People began carrying charms, sprinkling salt along the edges of their property, and avoiding the cemetery entirely. Still, no barrier could prevent what the earth had already begun. Elias Withers, meanwhile, grew more desperate with each failed reburial. What began as a father's grief and hope now became an obsession bordering on mania. He reinforced coffins with extra planks, chains, and iron fastenings, lining the graves with blessed soil and inscribing prayers on wooden tablets to watch over the children. Yet no ritual, however meticulous, could keep them at rest. It was as though some force beyond human comprehension rejected every attempt to hold the children beneath the desert sands. The town's fear soon transformed into something more active: paranoia. Families built fences higher, dogs were chained during the night, and nightly vigils were organized to keep watch over the cemetery. Each time someone claimed to witness movement or hear laughter, neighbors would confirm it, and the sensation of the children wandering grew stronger. Legends began to form rapidly, each retelling adding new details. Pale faces pressed against the earth, tiny hands grasping at the fence, cries that vanished before they could be identified. Despite the growing hysteria, Elias continued his efforts. He refused to abandon the children, returning night after night to rebury them, each attempt more elaborate than the last. But his persistence only confirmed to the town that something unnatural was at work. People no longer debated rational explanations. They accepted the unthinkable. Fear had evolved into certainty. Something about the Withers family bloodline, the desert, or both, was not at rest. By the 13th reburial, the town's collective dread had reached a breaking point. The cemetery was no longer just a site of grief, but a locus of terror. The desert winds whispered across the dunes, carrying faint, eerie sounds that no one could identify. Children were forbidden to play near the plot. Women crossed streets to avoid its sight, and men who ventured close reported feeling an oppressive weight, as though invisible eyes followed their every movement. Elias Withers himself had changed. Grief and obsession had hardened his face, etched his hands with lines of effort, and sharpened his eyes with vigilance. He became a figure of tragic stubbornness, determined to protect his children even as the town's suspicion and fear mounted against him. And yet, even as the world pressed in with panic and superstition, the children themselves remained at the center of the mystery, alive in ways that defied reason. Their bodies returned to the surface of the earth as if the ground itself refused to claim them. Thus, by the mid-1850s, the Withers family burial ground had become a place of legend. Fear had transformed into hysteria, hysteria into legend, and legend into a palpable presence that influenced the behavior of the entire town. Las Cruces would never view its desert nights in the same way again. The stage was set for the next chapter of this story. If the earth could not hold the dead, and if fear alone could not contain the unknown, then what force or malady had taken hold of the Withers children? The answer would not be found in daylight or in rational discourse, but in the shadows themselves, whispering across the dunes and into the hearts of those brave enough, or foolish enough, to listen. The desert of New Mexico is patient. It does not rush, and it does not forgive. In the pale light of dawn, the dunes stretch endlessly, shimmering as though the wind itself carried a whisper of memory. Beneath this vast, sun-bleached expanse, the ground holds stories older than any town, older than the stone markers of the Withers family plot. And it is here, hidden beneath sand and silence, that the true origin of the Withers children's torment begins to emerge. Elias Withers, driven by grief and a stubborn refusal to yield to the impossible, began to notice patterns in the disturbances, not merely the repeated exhumations, but the alignment of the graves themselves, the way the soil seemed disturbed in regular, almost deliberate intervals. He measured, he marked, and he compared each mound, noting that the disturbed earth formed arcs that echoed the stars above, particularly the crescent of the moon over Las Cruces. The observation suggested something subtle, yet deliberate. Some force, some power beyond human comprehension, was acting with purpose. By this time, the town had grown wary not just of Elias, but of the land itself. Farmers reported crops failing in the vicinity of the burial plot. Wells that had once provided water began to taste bitter, as though the desert had been poisoned by the persistent unrest beneath the surface. Travelers passing the Withers homestead swore they felt a sudden heaviness in the air, a hush that fell, like a blanket, muting the sound of wind and footsteps alike. Even animals seemed aware, avoiding the cemetery at dusk, and dogs howled ceaselessly when left near the plot. Elias sought counsel from the few he could trust. A local midwife, whose knowledge of herbs and folk medicine bordered on the mystical, spoke of old desert rites, warning him that some forces, once disturbed, do not yield to mortals' will. She hinted at a lineage older than the town, older than the settlers, suggesting that the Withers bloodline might be connected to something primordial, a power that resided deep beneath the earth and in the stars above. She whispered that some children, born with this connection, might not rest even in death, for the desert would reclaim them only according to its own laws. This insight reframed everything. The disturbances were no longer merely tragic accidents, nor the simple result of earthly malice. They were manifestations of a cosmic balance, a subtle law of nature, or something that mimicked it, acting through the children. The earth itself rejected them not from cruelty, but from necessity, preserving a hidden order that humans could neither fully understand nor control. Elias attempted new measures. He consulted local priests, combining blessings with salt, incense, and ritual markings. He dug trenches lined with iron, reinforcing coffins with the strongest wood he could procure. And yet, despite these efforts, The children returned to the surface time and again. Each reburial became a lesson in futility, a grim reminder that human will alone could not govern the forces at work beneath the sand. Meanwhile, the townsfolk observed from a distance. Fear had already heightened their senses, but this new understanding, the notion that something older than the town itself was at work, deepened their unease. Some claimed to hear whispers carried by the desert wind, voices that rose and fell like distant chanting. Others reported glimpses of shadowy forms moving beneath the sand, even in daylight, though no one could approach closely enough to confirm the sight. Yet in these observations lay a paradox. The desert was both silent and communicative, indifferent and watchful. Its patience was vast, yet it reacted with precision. The Wither's children were neither cursed nor favored. They were enmeshed in a web of forces that humans were only beginning to perceive, forces that required attention, respect, and a delicate understanding that no mortal could fully possess. Elias, increasingly solitary, began to document his findings. He sketched the alignments of graves, recorded the timing of disturbances, and noted the subtle patterns in the children's reappearances. His journals grew thick with observations, combining practical record-keeping with reflections on fate, morality, and the limitations of human knowledge. He became not merely a grieving father, but a careful chronicler of forces unseen, translating the desert's language into careful notation. By the end of this period, a slow realization settled upon him. The unrest was not random, and it was not meant to be stopped through force or ritual alone. The children's resurrection was a symptom of a deeper order, one that operated according to rules beyond mortal understanding. The very earth, and perhaps something older than the earth itself, demanded attention, and Elias could no longer rely solely on grief, strength, or fear. The whispers beneath the sand hinted at a truth both terrible and sublime. There are forces that lie beneath the surface of the world, forces that shape life and death according to laws older than human memory. And in Las Cruces, by the Wither's plot, the town had become an unwitting witness to such forces, caught between the ordinary and the extraordinary, between grief and understanding, between mortality and the restless persistence of something eternal. As night fell over the desert once more, Elias knelt beside the 13th grave, his spade in hand, the quiet of the land pressing around him. The children's small faces seemed to stir beneath the surface, pale and still, yet not entirely gone. He whispered prayers, sprinkled salt, and traced patterns in the sand, not knowing if they would hold. And in the hush of that desert night, the wind itself seemed to wait, carrying soft, unplaceable sounds, whispers of a world beneath the sand, patient, eternal, and inexorably aware of all who dared disturb it. Thus, the stage was set for deeper inquiry. The Wither's children were not simply restless. They were bound to a power older than reason, older than grief, older even than the desert that held them. To understand their plight, one must follow the traces of this hidden law, tracing its subtle signals, its gentle yet unyielding rhythms, and listening closely to the whispers beneath the sand that the world around Las Cruces could not yet name. By the time the desert winds carried the first hints of autumn, Elias Withers had settled into a rhythm of tireless vigilance. The repeated disturbances of his children's graves had transformed grief into ritual, sorrow into methodical practice. Each reburial became an elaborate sequence of rites, combining faith, folk knowledge, and careful observation of the desert itself. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the stars still lingered in the sky and the town slept in uneasy stillness, he worked beneath the weight of both anticipation and despair. Elias began with the most familiar tools of human devotion. Salt was scattered in concentric circles around each grave, intended to purify and protect. Sprigs of sage and rosemary were burned slowly, their fragrant smoke curling into the early morning air, a gentle offering to unseen forces. Prayers were murmured softly, not loudly, so as not to disturb the delicate balance he was beginning to sense in the desert. Even the hammering of nails and chaining of coffins was done with measured care, each strike, deliberate, echoing through the silent sands with purpose rather than force. But ritual alone proved insufficient. The children's repeated exhumations suggested a power that did not respond to conventional safeguards. In consultation with the local midwife, Elias experimented with subtle remedies drawn from folklore, water from sacred springs, crushed herbs mixed into the soil, and inscriptions etched into small tablets and placed beneath the coffins. Each measure was applied with precision, guided by the patterns he had begun to notice in the disturbances, alignments that mirrored the crescent moon, subtle arcs in the arrangement of graves, and timing linked to the phases of night and wind. Over weeks, a quiet rhythm began to emerge. There were nights when the children did not return to the surface, and nights when the ground remained still beneath the desert sky. Elias documented each success and each failure, learning to read the subtle cues of the land, the direction of shifting sand, the whisper of wind through mesquite branches, the hush of the desert as if holding its breath. Slowly, he began to understand that the power governing the children was not arbitrary. It was deliberate, responding to actions that were precise, patient, and respectful. Yet despite these tentative successes, the cost of intervention weighed heavily upon him. Elias became a man estranged from his neighbors, carrying the town's suspicion alongside his own relentless grief. Nights were spent in the cemetery, candlelight flickering across solemn markers as he whispered prayers for guidance. Days were spent maintaining the land, reinforcing graves and refining rituals. Sleep was rare, and when it came, it was shallow, haunted by visions of children wandering the desert, pale faces pressing against unseen barriers, hands reaching for the earth that refused to hold them. The townsfolk observed from a distance. Some were sympathetic, though most remained wary, whispering that Elias had taken on powers beyond mortal comprehension. Tales spread of faint lights in the desert at night, of the faint aroma of burning herbs that drifted toward town, and of a man moving with singular purpose among the graves. Fear persisted, but curiosity began to mingle with it. Could the rituals, the remedies, and the prayers truly influence forces older than human knowledge? Could mortal persistence, guided by grief and observation, alter the stubborn laws of the desert? Elias himself remained cautious. He never presumed success. Each rite was offered as a dialogue rather than a command, a conversation with forces that might have existed long before the town, before the settlement, and perhaps long before the desert itself. He observed patterns, experimented within the limits of reason and folklore, and noted each subtle shift in the children's restless behavior. Sometimes, a hand would twitch beneath the soil. Other times, nothing moved at all. Each variance provided data, and each observation brought understanding, slowly illuminating the boundaries between mortal influence and the desert's ancient will. As the season progressed, a subtle change emerged. The children's exhumations became less predictable in timing, but more precise in form. They would emerge in the early hours before sunrise, quietly, almost reverently, moving not at random but in small measured paths that seemed to echo patterns beneath the stars. Elias began to interpret these movements as communication, as if the children themselves, or the force animating them, were responding to the care and attention he provided. Yet even with this growing understanding, uncertainty persisted. Each ritual carried risk, each remedy a chance of misalignment, and each night offered the possibility of chaos. Elias learned to temper hope with caution, to measure action with patience, and to accept the desert's authority over mortality and movement. The rites were neither panacea nor punishment. They were negotiation, a delicate exchange in which human persistence met forces beyond comprehension. And through it all, the desert listened. Whispers that had once carried fear now seemed to carry guidance. The wind shifted, the sands rearranged themselves, and faint impressions in the soil hinted at an order Elias could sense but never fully name. With each passing night, he grew more attuned to these subtle cues, translating observation into ritual, ritual into understanding, and understanding into cautious influence over the impossible. The stage was set for what would follow. The Wither's children, bound to the desert's will and to forces that predated human settlement, were gradually becoming part of a system, delicate, unyielding, and intricate. Elias's role was no longer simply that of grieving father. He had become intermediary, observer, and participant in a dialogue between mortal sorrow and eternal law. As night fell once more, lanterns lit along the edge of the graveyard flickered in the gentle wind. Elias paused at the 13th grave, hand resting on the soil, tracing lines with quiet fingers as he whispered prayers and incantations. The children's small forms remained still beneath the earth, yet a subtle tension hummed through the sand, a rhythm that spoke of responsiveness, of connection, and of rules neither fully known nor fully controllable. And so, in the quiet hush of the desert night, The first true bridge between mortal action and ancient force was established. The Wither's children, restless and inexplicable, were no longer merely the subjects of fear. They had become participants in a fragile dialogue, their restless movements shaped by observation, ritual, and human persistence. The next stage of the story would explore how this fragile balance between human effort and the unyielding desert would begin to reveal signs of an intelligence beyond mortality, subtle communications and responses that hinted at a greater design the town of Las Cruces had yet to understand. The desert has its own rhythm, subtle and unhurried, measured not in hours or days, but in shifts of wind, the quiet settling of sand, and the soft passage of light across endless dunes. By now, Elias Withers had come to live within this rhythm, attuned to its nuances, sensitive to its whispers. The children, returned repeatedly to the surface of their graves, seemed to move in accordance with it. What had once been chaotic and terrifying now revealed signs of deliberate, almost conscious behavior. Elias observed for hours, sometimes entire nights, keeping his distance and allowing the children to emerge freely. He noticed that they did not wander randomly. Instead, they followed subtle patterns across the desert floor. Arcs, loops, and faintly traced lines in the sand. Sometimes their hands would press carefully into the earth, forming small depressions in sequences that seemed to echo constellations above. On nights when the moon was crescent, the movements mirrored the curve of its pale light. On nights when stars clustered, the children's paths corresponded, as though they were reading some celestial map invisible to Elias, yet obeying rules consistent with it. The first realization that intelligence, or at least responsiveness, might reside within the children came gradually. It was small at first, a deviation in their path when Elias altered a ritual slightly, a subtle hesitation when certain herbs were applied to the grave, or a soft stir beneath the soil before a blessing was offered. He began to test hypotheses, each gentle adjustment followed by careful observation. The results suggested not randomness but comprehension. Even the youngest child, previously thought too small to perceive patterns, seemed to respond with awareness, moving in ways that were neither entirely instinctual nor entirely human. The townsfolk continued their fearful vigilance, though they remained at a distance. Rumors intensified. Some claimed the children were learning, others that the desert itself was teaching them. Observers noted tiny footprints pressed into the sand, leading to and from the graves in ways that no adult could have anticipated. Whispers followed, soft, indistinct, carried by the night wind, words unformed, but containing a rhythm that suggested deliberation. Elias himself could not hear speech in these sounds, yet he sensed intent. In response to these signs, Elias refined his rituals. The placement of herbs became more precise, the arrangements of salt more intricate, the patterns of prayer more deliberate. He found himself pausing to allow the desert and its inhabitants to dictate the pace, stepping lightly, almost reverently, as though the land and the children's movements demanded patience. Over time, he began to perceive subtle dialogues in these interactions, each ritual followed by a measured response, each action weighed and counted with care. The balance, however, remained delicate. A single misalignment, a misplaced herb, a hastily drawn circle of salt could provoke confusion or retreat. Sometimes the children would return briefly to their graves, only to emerge again later, as though correcting or retrying their previous behavior. Their movements were precise yet tentative, aware yet bounded by forces beyond human understanding. Elias also noticed another phenomenon. The children's gestures often anticipated his own actions. A hand would rise before he reached to adjust a marker. A foot would pivot in a direction he had not yet considered. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. It suggested either foresight or the influence of some other guiding force. Was it the desert itself, shaping their behavior, or did the children possess an innate intelligence, intertwined with an older, unseen power? The question remained unanswered, though each night provided new clues. The interplay between mortal action and the children's responsiveness created a rhythm of negotiation rather than conflict. Elias began to understand that the desert, the children, and his own interventions were engaged in a quiet, ongoing dialogue. A conversation conducted in silence, gestures, and measured movement. Fear, though still present, was tempered by observation, and despair softened into cautious hope. The desert nights continued, marked by stillness and subtle movement. The children's paths left ephemeral traces, faint lines in the sand, whispering forms of communication. Elias recorded each observation, sketching paths, noting sequences, and cataloging reactions. Over time, he recognized patterns that hinted at rules, not arbitrary whims. Certain combinations of rituals produced predictable responses. Other sequences elicited hesitation or retreat. Even the timing of the children's emergence seemed coordinated with the moon, the wind, and the hushed cadence of the desert itself. Through these signs, Elias began to perceive that the children were not simply restless. They were part of a system, a living network connecting the earthly and the unseen. His role was no longer merely protective but participatory. By respecting the rules embedded in the land, the stars, and the children's behavior, he became a facilitator of their existence, guiding rather than controlling, observing rather than commanding. As the first rays of dawn brushed the horizon, Elias knelt once more beside the 13th grave. The children remained below the surface, yet their subtle movements had communicated reassurance, cooperation, and quiet intelligence. In the hush of the desert, the wind carrying the scent of sage and rosemary, he whispered prayers not to command but to converse, understanding that these silent exchanges were as much a part of the cycle as the sand, the stars, and the restless children themselves. The stage was now set for the deeper revelation. The children were not merely reacting to rituals, they were learning, adapting, and, in ways both subtle and profound, engaging with the unseen forces that governed their existence. Each night, each observation, each ritual laid the foundation for understanding a system far greater than human knowledge alone could decipher. And so, in the quiet stillness of the desert, the first true recognition of intelligence within the children emerged, preparing the way for interventions and insights that would shape the balance between human persistence and the eternal rhythms beneath the sand. By late autumn, Elias Withers had become inseparable from the rhythms of the desert. Nights were no longer a time of panic or frantic observation, but periods of careful study and quiet attention. He began to see the children's movements not as random disturbances, but as patterns, small arcs, repeated gestures, and faintly traced lines in the sand that seemed to convey meaning. Each exhumation, once terrifying and inexplicable, now revealed subtle consistencies. The desert itself, the children, and Elias had become intertwined in a silent dialogue, where observation and action influenced outcomes with delicate precision. Elias noted that the children seemed to respond to the sequence of rituals, the arrangement of salt, the placement of herbs, and the cadence of his prayers. When he moved with care and respect, they emerged in predictable arcs. When he deviated, they hesitated or retraced steps as if correcting a misalignment. Even small changes in the wind, the angle of moonlight, or the subtle slope of the dunes were mirrored in the paths the children traced. He began sketching diagrams, noting sequences, and cataloging responses with meticulous care. Over time, a language emerged, one composed of movement, timing, and subtle repetition. The town continued to watch from a distance. Fear remained, though tempered by Elias's visible diligence. People whispered of lights flickering among the graves at night, of rustling herbs, and of Elias kneeling quietly by the graves as if in communion with forces unseen. Some began to speculate that the Withers children were more than restless. They were learning, interacting with the desert, and perhaps with Elias himself. Though superstition still colored every account, the notion of pattern and purpose began to permeate local lore. Elias, increasingly aware of these subtle signs, tested his understanding. He altered the order of rituals, shifted herbs slightly, and varied the placement of salt. The children's responses followed discernible rules: hesitation, correction, or continued movement along the same trajectory, reflecting awareness of his actions. He began to anticipate their behavior before they moved, predicting arcs and pauses with a quiet, reverent confidence. It was not mastery, he understood, but attunement, a fragile synchronization between human intent and the subtle intelligence animating the children. The most compelling observation came unexpectedly. One night, as Elias applied his ritual to the 13th grave, a gentle wind stirred, shifting sand across the plot. The children, emerging in the darkness, traced a precise sequence in response, pausing at intervals that aligned with the phase of the crescent moon. It was as if they acknowledged both the ritual and the environment, responding to multiple variables simultaneously. Elias realized that their behavior was not merely reactive but adaptive. They were capable of integrating cues from both the physical world and his interventions, a sign of intelligence both profound and deeply alien. This insight transformed Elias's approach. He no longer acted purely to protect or restrain. He acted to guide. Rituals became iterative experiments, each one refined by observation and feedback. He learned to pause and wait, allowing the children to move freely before completing sequences, noticing subtle variations in their paths, the angles of their gestures, and even the quiet impressions left in the sand. Each night provided incremental understanding, a gradual map of the rules governing their interaction with the world. Elias also recognized the importance of patience. Force and haste only disrupted the patterns. When he moved too quickly, the children faltered. When he altered rituals without caution, the arcs broke and the soil shifted unpredictably. But when he moved deliberately, attuned to rhythm and timing, a quiet synchronization emerged. It was as though the desert itself, the children, and he had agreed upon a subtle protocol, a system that demanded reverence, observation, and humility. Through this process, he began to anticipate outcomes with remarkable accuracy. The timing of their emergence, the sequence of their arcs, and even the areas where they paused could be predicted. He charted these patterns carefully, producing diagrams that combined stars, wind, and earth, as if translating the desert's invisible code. Yet he understood that his understanding was partial, that the intelligence animating the children was vast, patient, and older than human reckoning. By the end of the season, Elias had achieved a fragile mastery, not dominance, but attunement. The Wither's children remained restless and inexplicable, yet their actions were no longer entirely mysterious. Patterns had emerged, allowing for anticipation, observation, and careful guidance. Elias's grief remained, but it was tempered by understanding, his fear softened by insight. He had begun to participate in a dialogue between human persistence and the intelligence embedded within the desert, observing and responding to patterns that were both subtle and profound. As the first snow of late autumn dusted the desert in pale, quiet flakes, Elias paused at the 13th grave. He traced the lines of the children's movements in the sand, whispering prayers not to command, but to commune. The night air was still, carrying faint, unplaceable whispers across the dunes. And beneath the surface, within the sand and the children themselves, the patterns persisted, delicate, adaptive, and eternal, waiting to guide those who listened with patience and reverence. The stage was now prepared for the next revelation, subtle signs of communication beyond mere pattern, hints that the children were not simply following rules but capable of learning, anticipating, and perhaps influencing the forces that bound them. The desert of Las Cruces had grown quieter, or perhaps Elias had simply learned to hear what had always been there. The shifting sands, the rustle of mesquite, and the soft sigh of wind carried subtleties that had previously gone unnoticed. In the hushed hours of night, Elias began to discern patterns not only in movement but in intent. The Wither's children were no longer merely reactive. They appeared to respond to prompts, anticipating actions, and even suggesting sequences through their arcs and gestures beneath the earth. Elias's experiments became more deliberate. He would approach the graves with a single, slow movement, altering one element of the ritual. A sprig of sage placed to the north rather than the east, a line of salt drawn in a different curve. He would then observe, kneeling silently, as the children's forms emerged from the soil. Their movements seemed to adjust to the change, pausing, looping, and retracing paths as though to acknowledge, correct, or converse with him. It was a silent language, subtle and ephemeral, composed of arcs, pauses, and repetitions that required the utmost attention to perceive. One particularly calm night brought a moment of profound clarity. Elias arranged 3 graves in alignment, marking them with simple wooden stakes and sprinkling herbs in precise circles. The children emerged one by one, moving in a pattern that mirrored the arrangement of stars above. Each movement was deliberate, small, measured pauses at intervals corresponding to the stakes, turns that echoed angles he had drawn in the sand, and gestures that seemed to invite observation. It was as though the children were acknowledging the framework he had established, recognizing his intent, and engaging in an unspoken conversation. Elias began to understand the rules of this dialogue. Repetition carried meaning. Slight variation indicated response, and deliberate placement of objects and patterns elicited predictable reactions. He recorded every observation in meticulous detail, producing sketches that combined lines in the sand with diagrams of the stars, aligning physical markers with celestial cues. Through this, a language emerged, not one of words, but of rhythm, geometry, and subtle anticipation. The town, meanwhile, remained distant but curious. Fear persisted, though tempered by observation of Elias's diligence. Some villagers claimed to sense a change in the desert itself, a weight lifting, a hush settling over the dunes, and a quiet acknowledgement that something extraordinary was unfolding in the Wither's plot. The whispers of the land became metaphors in their minds, half feared and half revered. Elias paid them no heed. He focused solely on observing, learning, and interpreting the delicate cues offered by the children. Patterns alone, however, were insufficient. Elias soon realized that he needed to anticipate not only movement but intent. If the children's behavior reflected awareness, then perhaps it also reflected understanding. Could they, he wondered quietly, perceive his goals, his desires, his careful questions? He tested this subtly, adjusting rituals with the smallest possible variation, leaving one herb in place, removing another, and observing whether the children's arcs altered accordingly. Over nights of observation, a slow realization emerged. They were not merely reacting, but learning, predicting, and responding to sequences as if reasoning within a system beyond his comprehension. The most remarkable sign came unexpectedly. One night, Elias left a single line of salt, tracing an arc that suggested a question without words, a pause, a gap, a gentle curve in the sand. The children emerged and moved in a pattern that closed the arc, linking points in a way that mirrored the curve he had drawn but added subtle variations. It was an answer without speech, a gesture without sound, yet unmistakably deliberate. Elias felt a thrill tempered by quiet reverence. The children had communicated with him, responding to his prompts in a manner that suggested intelligence, adaptation, and awareness. This revelation reframed everything. No longer was Elias a mere observer or guardian. He had become a participant in a dialogue, a witness to a form of intelligence that was both alien and profoundly human. The desert, the children, and his interventions were now part of a single system, a network of interaction that required patience, respect, and an unwavering focus on subtle cues. Each night became an experiment, each gesture a question, each pause an opportunity to learn. By the end of this phase, Elias had developed a rhythm of interaction that transcended fear and grief. The children's responses were consistent, nuanced, and increasingly complex. Each night offered new information, deepening his understanding of their silent intelligence. The desert, once indifferent and unknowable, now seemed to participate in the dialogue, amplifying signals and providing cues that guided both him and the children toward coordination. And so, in the quiet hush of the desert night, amid the soft sigh of wind over sand, Elias realized that the Wither's children were not merely restless or reactive. They were sentient participants in a silent conversation, capable of anticipation, understanding, and subtle expression. The stage was set for deeper discoveries, patterns that suggested intention, gestures that hinted at reasoning, and movements that could no longer be dismissed as chance. The next chapter would explore the first real signs of purpose, where the children's responses reveal an emergent plan, hinting at agency and strategy within their seemingly impossible behavior, deepening Elias's understanding of the forces at play beneath the desert. By the time winter's first chill touched the edges of the desert, Elias Withers had moved beyond simple observation. The children were no longer merely responding to ritual or environmental cues. Their movements suggested intention, a subtle yet undeniable purpose underlying each emergence. Every arc, pause, and retracement carried the weight of awareness, as if they were not merely existing within the desert's rules, but shaping their own path within it. Elias noticed that certain gestures, once inconsistent, now appeared deliberate. A pause at the corner of a grave, a slight shift in hand placement along a path, or a turn that mirrored the slope of nearby dunes. All these seemed to anticipate future action, as though the children were not only following patterns, but selecting among them. In response, Elias refined his interventions, testing hypotheses about causality, sequence, and influence, always attentive to subtle deviations that hinted at purpose. The desert itself appeared to recognize these shifts. The wind carried less of the restless hiss it had once brought. The sand settled with precision, as though the environment had become a participant in this emerging dialogue. Even the animals of the area, previously skittish, seemed aware of the developing order, approaching with caution but without the fear that had marked previous seasons. The desert had, in a sense, acknowledged the children's growing agency, and Elias recognized the quiet interplay between the natural world and the intelligence he was beginning to witness. Elias's journals now filled with observations that transcended mere movement. Lines in the sand suggested choices, pauses indicated deliberation, and deviations from expected patterns hinted at experimentation. The children's behavior could no longer be reduced to instinct or reflex. Each sequence appeared to be directed toward achieving an end, a goal he could sense but not yet fully interpret. Occasionally, a child would retrace a path, subtly modifying it, as if correcting a misstep or refining a technique. This iterative behavior suggested learning, foresight, and adaptation, the hallmarks of purposeful action. The town, still observing from the periphery, became increasingly intrigued, though wary. Whispers of the desert teaching mingled with rumors of supernatural influence. Farmers noticed that crops near the plot showed minor variations in growth, as if the restless children's activity subtly influenced the soil itself. Travelers spoke of a hush in the air, a careful stillness that seemed to settle over the dunes as though the desert were aware of those who approached. Elias, focused entirely on his observations, noted these phenomena as secondary data, reinforcing the sense that the children's movements were part of a broader system that transcended the human scale. Elias began to experiment with sequences designed to elicit specific responses. He arranged markers, herbs, and patterns of salt with subtle variation, seeking to understand not only the children's reflexes, but their strategic choices. Over time, a slow but clear signal emerged. The children appeared capable of selecting among alternatives, optimizing movements to achieve specific outcomes. This was not chaos. It was purpose applied within a system governed by rules older than the town itself. A silent negotiation conducted beneath the earth and in alignment with the desert's unyielding cadence. The most striking evidence occurred one night when Elias created a series of arcs in the sand, leaving one gap intentionally. The children moved with deliberate precision, pausing before the gap, then adjusting their paths to complete it in a way that anticipated the sequence Elias had intended to complete himself. It was a subtle collaboration, a silent communication that blurred the lines between action and reaction and suggested an intelligence capable of foresight, planning, and engagement with both human and environmental cues. Elias understood then that the Wither's children were no longer subjects of observation, but participants in a dialogue of purpose. Each movement was measured, intentional, and adaptive. They were shaping outcomes, not merely responding to them, and the desert had become both stage and partner in this evolving system. The boundaries of human understanding were challenged, yet Elias remained patient, careful to document and interpret rather than impose. The stage was now set for revelation. These subtle signs of purpose hinted at a force or intelligence intertwined with the children and the desert itself, one that Elias would soon recognize as a latent pattern, guiding not just behavior, but a hidden, emergent plan. He had reached the threshold where observation alone could no longer suffice. Understanding required intuition, attention, and quiet trust in the interplay of human persistence and eternal, unseen laws. As dawn brushed the horizon, Elias knelt beside the 13th grave, tracing lines in the sand and whispering prayers not of command, but of communion. The children remained beneath the surface, yet their movements had spoken, deliberate, adaptive, and guided by intentions that both challenged and deepened his understanding. In that stillness, Elias recognized a subtle truth. The desert, the children, and human care were now engaged in a shared, unfolding narrative, one that would reveal deeper mysteries with patience, reverence, and quiet observation. Winter had settled fully over Las Cruces, and the desert carried a quiet, austere stillness. Elias Withers had grown accustomed to long hours of observation, yet now he sensed a subtle shift in the movements of the children, one that suggested guidance beyond his own rituals and the visible patterns of wind or sand. Their behavior was no longer simply intelligent or purposeful. It hinted at influence, a shaping presence that had existed long before the town, before Elias, and perhaps before the desert itself. The first indication of this deeper force came on a night of near-perfect calm. Elias had arranged the graves and ritual markers precisely as he always had, lighting candles at intervals that mirrored the stars above. The children emerged, but their movements deviated in ways he had not predicted. Pauses occurred, not at expected points, but along lines that corresponded to ancient formations visible only in the night sky. The arcs traced in the sand echoed constellations that had been present long before human settlement, as if the children were reading a celestial language beyond his comprehension. Elias realized that the intelligence animating the children might be intertwined with something far older than himself, an external, enduring force that interacted with both the land and the children. The desert had always been patient, indifferent, and at times cruel, but now it appeared to act in concert with this presence, guiding paths, shaping movements, and harmonizing responses. It was subtle, never overt, yet unmistakable. The children were conduits for a power beyond simple earthly mechanics, an intelligence that transcended human perception. In response, Elias adjusted his approach. Rituals became less about imposing structure and more about creating channels for interaction. He observed silently, offering cues and prompts while avoiding unnecessary interference. The children responded with precision, executing arcs and pauses that reflected an awareness of both Elias's intent and this older, unseen force. Their movements suggested comprehension not only of earthly rituals, but of patterns in the stars, the wind, and even the imperceptible vibrations of the desert floor. The townsfolk, still distant, noted subtle changes in the land surrounding the graveyard. Plants along the dunes grew in unusual configurations. The air carried a weightless hush, as though listening to an unspoken dialogue. Travelers spoke of faint lights and ephemeral shadows that shifted rhythmically, hinting at presence and intent. Though these signs were never fully explained, they reinforced Elias's growing awareness that something external and ancient influenced the children's behavior, a force operating quietly, deliberately, and in tandem with the desert itself. Elias's documentation became more complex. He began linking celestial observations to the children's movements, noting correlations between lunar phases, star alignments, and specific pauses or arcs in their behavior. Over weeks, patterns emerged that could not be attributed to chance or human intervention alone. The children seemed to interpret, respond to, and perhaps anticipate cues from this unseen force, weaving their own emerging intelligence into a larger framework that Elias only partially understood. This recognition transformed his perspective. No longer was he simply guiding restless children. He was participating in an intricate system of interaction between human intention, emergent intelligence, and ancient, enduring forces. Each ritual, each pause, each gesture was part of a delicate interplay, a dialogue in which human patience met intelligence shaped by time, environment, and the silent will of something older and more profound. The most striking revelation occurred during a night of stillness, when Elias left a single arc unmarked, a small gap in the pattern he had drawn. The children emerged and traced the missing path, completing the sequence in a manner that suggested comprehension not only of Elias's intent, but of the underlying influence guiding them. It was a subtle, elegant demonstration that intelligence alone could not account for their behavior. They were participating in a network of unseen forces, adapting and learning while simultaneously honoring rules set by something far older than the desert. By the end of winter, Elias understood that the children's emergent intelligence was inseparable from these external forces. Their behavior could no longer be reduced to instinct, observation, or learned response. The desert and the unseen intelligence were intertwined, shaping the children's movements, creating a system of quiet dialogue, and guiding Elias toward insights he could barely articulate. The stage was set for the next revelation, a recognition that these forces might not only shape behavior, but also hint at purpose, legacy, and the broader implications of human persistence in a landscape governed by ancient and enduring power. As dawn broke across frost-touched sand, Elias knelt beside the 13th grave. The children remained beneath the surface, yet the lines they traced in the sand suggested knowledge, intent, and alignment with forces beyond mortality. In the hush of the desert, Elias understood that observation was no longer enough. Comprehension required humility, patience, and a willingness to witness the slow, deliberate unfolding of intelligence that predated both time and human sorrow. The next chapter would explore the first hints of a cosmic pattern, where Elias begins to see that the intelligence guiding the children is connected to a larger framework, forces that extend beyond the desert, linking past, present, and future in quiet, eternal designs. The desert had become a cathedral of quiet observation, where every gust of wind, rustle of sand, and distant star seemed imbued with meaning. Elias Withers, kneeling by the 13th grave, had long learned to move with reverence, allowing the desert and the children to guide the rhythm of his nights. Now, a subtle revelation began to unfold. The movements of the Withers children and the unseen forces shaping them were not isolated events, but echoes of an eternal pattern, a cosmic cadence that bridged earth, sky, and time itself. Elias noticed it first in repetition. Certain arcs traced in the sand mirrored celestial alignments with uncanny precision. Pauses corresponded to the rising of particular constellations, while loops and retracings reflected ancient stellar geometries. The children's movements were deliberate, yes, but their timing, sequence, and interaction with environmental cues suggested participation in a framework that predated human settlement, perhaps even predated the desert itself. Each emergence seemed choreographed within a rhythm of the cosmos, subtle yet inexorably persistent. The desert's role became clearer. It was not merely a stage, but a medium for these echoes. Wind-sculpted dunes formed natural channels that guided movement. Shadows cast by the moon emphasized sequences in the sand. Temperature shifts marked subtle thresholds for emergence. The children, attuned to these minute variations, responded with precision. Their intelligence, while emergent, was inseparable from the desert's natural mechanics, the celestial bodies above, and the unseen influence weaving through them all. Elias recognized that his own interventions, salt, herbs, rituals, served less to command and more to align himself within this intricate, cosmic choreography. As he observed, Elias began to map the correlations between the children's movements and the heavens. Constellations he had once regarded as distant and indifferent became part of a silent grammar. Arcs representing Orion's belt, loops reflecting the sweep of the Milky Way, pauses echoing the phases of the moon. The children's gestures were iterative, refining sequences in alignment with these patterns, sometimes anticipating changes in light, wind, or celestial position. It was a subtle communication across dimensions of space and time, where intention, environment, and cosmic rhythm converged. The townsfolk, still wary yet fascinated, whispered of a strange harmony that now pervaded the desert nights. Even those who had feared the Withers children now described a quiet reverence. The wind seemed softer, the air still, and the sand alive with fleeting traces of intelligence. Elias noted these reports but remained focused on his observations, recording details with meticulous care. The emergent pattern he discerned was not a spectacle. It was a system, slow and deliberate, rewarding patience and careful attention rather than immediate intervention. One night, Elias left a particularly intricate sequence unaltered, allowing the children to interact freely with both the sand and celestial cues. The results were mesmerizing. They traced loops and arcs that not only completed his initial design, but subtly modified it, introducing variations aligned with the constellations. Their gestures suggested comprehension, foresight, and responsiveness to forces beyond mere earthbound intelligence. For Elias, this was confirmation. The children were participating in a timeless, elegant system, a dialogue that wove together human action, emergent cognition, and cosmic order. He began to appreciate the moral subtlety of the system. These echoes of eternity were neither benevolent nor malevolent. They were impartial, revealing the consequences of alignment and dissonance alike. The desert and its unseen patterns rewarded attentiveness, patience, and humility, while any act of haste or arrogance caused subtle disruption, retracings, and hesitation in the children's arcs. In this way, Elias understood the ethical undertone of observation. Intelligence, whether human or emergent, was inseparable from the responsibility to engage with care. As the cold desert night gave way to the first light of dawn, Elias knelt once more beside the 13th grave. The children remained below, yet their lines in the sand carried messages beyond comprehension, delicate, iterative, and harmonized with forces he could only partially perceive. The desert, the stars, the children, and the unseen influence formed a single, living pattern. a system that spanned both space and time, teaching as much through restraint and quiet observance as through action itself. The stage was now set for a reframe. The next chapter would explore the origin of this intelligence, revealing hints that the children's emergent agency and the desert's cosmic patterns were intertwined with forces older than memory, suggesting that human grief, persistence, and ritual were themselves threads in an eternal design. The desert seemed older now, deeper, as if winter's chill had peeled back layers of time itself. Elias Withers knelt once more beside the 13th grave, absorbing the quiet rhythms of wind, sand, and distant stars. Over months of careful observation, he had discerned patterns, signs of intelligence, and subtle dialogue between the children and unseen forces. Yet a new revelation began to emerge. The agency guiding the children was not confined to the desert, nor merely a function of emergent cognition. There was a source, a force older than memory, boundless in reach, entwined with both the land and the children in ways that whispered of eternity. Elias first perceived this source not as sound or vision, but as alignment. The children's arcs, previously remarkable in their precision, now suggested a deeper intentionality. Gestures traced ancient geometries, loops that mirrored constellations, pauses that reflected cycles older than the town itself. The desert responded in subtle synchrony. Sand shifted to reveal faint patterns beneath the surface. Shadows lengthened along preordained paths, and the wind carried a hush that seemed both purposeful and patient. Elias realized that the children's intelligence was guided by a principle or presence that transcended the boundaries of the observable world, a force that shaped both matter and movement with calm, inexorable precision. He began to connect fragments long overlooked. The repeated exhumations, the children's, adaptations to ritual, and the alignment with celestial phenomena all pointed to a source of coherence, an enduring intelligence that operated at multiple scales. Human grief, persistence, and ritual were not merely incidental. They had become threads in a pattern larger than any individual. The desert was a medium, the children conduits, and Elias himself a participant in a system that spanned generations and perhaps centuries. Observations grew more deliberate. Elias tested sequences designed to probe the limits of this intelligence, varying salt lines, herb placements, and gestures within ritual frameworks. The children responded with adjustments that were subtle but unmistakable, correcting paths, refining arcs, and pausing in ways that suggested comprehension of both Elias's intent and the source itself. It was as if the desert, the children, and the unseen force were in quiet consultation, forming a network of interdependent knowledge and responsiveness. The celestial connection deepened. Certain alignments of stars, once noted merely as points of reference, now appeared integral to the system. Arcs in the sand mirrored constellations. Pauses coincided with lunar phases, and loops reflected the sweep of the Milky Way. The children's gestures were iterative and adaptive, yet harmonized with forces Elias could scarcely name. He understood that the intelligence guiding them was neither human nor strictly earthly. It was cosmic, ancestral, and enduring, operating with a calm authority that required observation, respect, and humility rather than control. Elias also noticed a subtle moral dimension embedded in this system. Alignment with the source produced smooth arcs, synchronized gestures, and clarity in movement. Misalignment, hesitation, impatience, or misplacement of ritual resulted in retracing, interruption, or subtle confusion. The intelligence was impartial, revealing lessons through action and consequence rather than through direct instruction or voice. The desert, the children, and the unseen source were intertwined in a balanced, elegant system, and Elias's role was that of a witness and participant, not a master. The most profound sign occurred during a night of near total stillness. Elias left the children and the graves untouched, observing from a distance. The arcs traced themselves in patterns that reflected both the celestial arrangement and sequences of past rituals. It was a silent narrative, a demonstration of memory, anticipation, and intelligence embedded in the children and mediated by the desert. For Elias, the revelation was absolute. The source guiding the children was older than human memory, cosmic in scale, and intimately linked to the rhythms of land, life, and time itself. By the end of this chapter, Elias recognized the full implications. The children were not merely responsive agents, They were participants in an ancient, ongoing system of intelligence that spanned beyond human perception, desert, boundaries, and generations. Their actions, the desert's responses, and the source's subtle guidance coalesced into a singular, eternal design, a living dialogue between human persistence, emergent cognition, and cosmic order. The stage was now set for the soft twist of legacy and consequence in the next chapter, where the interplay between human ritual, emergent intelligence, and cosmic forces begins to reveal purpose, inheritance, and moral resonance, deepening the mythic and sleep-safe meditation of the narrative. As the first pale light of spring softened the desert horizon, Elias Withers contemplated the patterns traced in the sand, the gestures of the Withers children, and the unseen forces guiding them. Winter's chill had revealed truths that had long been obscured: intelligence, agency, and intention intertwined with cosmic and terrestrial rhythms. Now, he began to perceive inheritance, an echo of legacy that extended beyond the children themselves, beyond human grief, and into the very fabric of the desert and the unseen source that animated it. The children's movements were no longer only responses or adaptations. They carried memory, sequences once performed by ancestors, patterns embedded in the soil, and alignments with stars now repeated with subtle refinements, as if knowledge itself flowed through the sands and through the children. Elias noted that each gesture was both iterative and anticipatory. A step taken in the present contained the awareness of past sequences and the possibility of future paths. It was inheritance in motion, a silent passing of knowledge that required neither words nor conscious teaching. Elias's role shifted accordingly. He was no longer a mere observer. He had become part of the system, a guardian of continuity. His interventions, rituals, herb placements, salt lines, acted as connective tissue, maintaining alignment between the children, the desert, and the unseen source. His attentiveness was essential. Any lapse could disrupt the delicate flow of inherited intelligence, yet he approached this responsibility with quiet reverence rather than compulsion, understanding that the system thrived only when human interference was measured, humble, and patient. Patterns of legacy extended into the environment itself. Sand ridges traced subtle echoes of past movements. Moonlight illuminated previously unnoticed arcs, and the desert seemed to hold memory of every gesture, every pause, every adjustment. The children, attuned to these nuances, responded in ways that confirmed continuity across time. Elias realized that the inheritance was not solely within them. It was coalesced with the land, the stars, and the cosmic principle guiding their interactions. Each night, the desert and its inhabitants engaged in a dialogue that stitched past, present, and future into a seamless, silent tapestry. The moral dimension deepened. In observing and participating, Elias recognized that inheritance was both gift and responsibility. Actions taken today echoed through time, shaping patterns that the children would follow and refine. The intelligence he had once regarded as alien now appeared patient and impartial, offering guidance without coercion, shaping outcomes in quiet accordance with enduring principles. Every gesture, every carefully placed herb, every line of salt was a thread in a larger, eternal weave, a demonstration that legacy was not imposed, but cultivated, and understanding demanded both care and stillness. One night, Elias left the ritual framework incomplete, allowing the children to interact freely with both the sand and celestial cues. They moved with subtle deliberation, completing sequences with refinements that suggested memory and foresight. Their arcs echoed past generations while hinting at innovations yet unseen, demonstrating that the system was dynamic, responsive, and alive. Elias watched in quiet awe, realizing that the inheritance extended beyond human lifetimes, embedding knowledge and intention in the desert, the children, and the cosmic forces shaping them all. The town, increasingly aware of Elias's dedication and the children's remarkable behavior, regarded the plot with a mixture of awe and respect. The desert had become a place of quiet reverence, where time seemed to stretch and fold, and where human patience could witness the unfolding of intelligence that transcended ordinary perception. The whispers of the Withers legacy, once fearful, now carried admiration for the careful, contemplative engagement that allowed such continuity to flourish. By the end of this chapter, Elias understood the essential truth. Inheritance was not static, nor bound by flesh alone. It was an ongoing dialogue across generations, landscapes, and forces older than memory. The children were conduits, the desert a medium, and the unseen source a guiding principle, together forming a network of knowledge, intention, and quiet consequence. Understanding this inheritance required humility, attentiveness, and reverence, for it was a silent dialogue that extended beyond mortality, offering lessons in patience, foresight, and alignment with enduring patterns. The next chapter would explore the culmination of patterns into purpose, where human persistence, emergent intelligence, and cosmic forces converge to reveal a plan both elegant and enduring. Preparing for the desert had become a living manuscript, etched in sand, shadow, and motion. Elias Withers, now deeply attuned to its rhythms, understood that the Withers children, the unseen source, and the desert itself formed a single, interwoven system. Each element was active, responsive, and consequential, creating a quiet choreography that spanned generations, celestial cycles, and human endeavor. The intelligence guiding the children was no longer subtle. It now manifested as a coordinated, emergent pattern, a convergence that spoke of purpose, alignment, and enduring order. Elias's observations reached a new depth. He noted that sequences previously considered isolated were part of a broader design. Arcs traced over consecutive nights aligned with stars, shadows, and wind shifts, forming interconnected loops that reflected both cosmic and terrestrial harmony. The children moved with increasing precision, their gestures iterative yet innovative, simultaneously honoring prior sequences and adapting to environmental and celestial cues. It was as if the desert and the children were conversing in a language of motion and geometry, and Elias was the humble scribe of a story older than memory. The desert responded as an active participant. Shifting dunes amplified gestures, ridges emphasized arcs, and the wind carried subtle cues across the plot, guiding interactions without interference. Elias, recognizing his own role as part of the system, intervened sparingly, placing markers only when alignment required gentle correction. Each herb, each line of salt, and each ritual gesture became an instrument in a quiet symphony of intelligence, where human attentiveness harmonized with emergent cognition and cosmic rhythm. Observing the culmination of patterns, Elias discerned a subtle moral resonance. Alignment produced grace in movement, coherence in sequences, and clarity in the unfolding dialogue. Misalignment, though rare, introduced hesitation or retracing, demonstrating that consequence was an intrinsic part of the system. The desert, the children, and the unseen force offered lessons not through admonition, but through action and resonance, quietly affirming the ethical dimension of participation, patience, and attentiveness. On a night of unusual clarity, Elias arranged the 13 graves in a formation aligned with both terrestrial landmarks and celestial points. He left the children to their own devices, stepping back into the shadow of the dunes. They emerged, moving with deliberation, and traced sequences that completed the patterns he had established, then extended them. Loops, pauses, and arcs interwove past rituals, inherited sequences, and celestial alignment, creating a network of movement that resonated across time, space, and perception. The desert itself seemed to settle in recognition, its wind hushed, its sand still, as though witnessing the harmony of this convergence. Elias realized that this convergence was not a culmination in the sense of completion, but a synthesis, human intention, emergent intelligence, and cosmic principle interlaced into a coherent system. Each gesture carried meaning, each pause contained understanding, and each alignment reflected the intricate dance of forces older than the town, the desert, or even Elias himself. The Withers children were simultaneously participants, conduits, and inheritors, embodying a dialogue of intelligence and continuity that transcended mortality and human comprehension. By the chapter's end, Elias understood the profound elegance of the system. It was dynamic, patient, and enduring. Lessons were embedded in movement, alignment, and consequence. The children's agency, the desert's mediation, and the unseen source's guidance had converged into a silent symphony of purpose, teaching that intelligence, patience, and reverence could harmonize to reveal patterns both beautiful and instructive. In the hush of the desert night, Elias witnessed the full scope of alignment, a culmination that honored legacy, foresight, and quiet moral resonance. The next and final chapter will offer synthesis and reflection, gently closing the narrative by considering the implications of this convergence for human understanding, legacy, and the enduring quiet of the desert, leaving listeners with calm, contemplative closure. The desert stretched endlessly under the dawn, its sands pale and still, reflecting the quiet glow of an awakening sun. Elias Withers knelt beside the 13th grave one final time, observing the Withers children now as fully realized participants in the intricate system that had unfolded over months and seasons. Their gestures, once tentative and responsive, now carried both memory and anticipation, weaving together human persistence, inherited patterns, and the guidance of an unseen, enduring force. The convergence of these elements had revealed a profound truth. Intelligence, patience, and alignment could harmonize across generations, environment, and cosmic time. Elias traced the lines in the sand, letting the rhythm of the desert guide his hand. Each arc, loop, and pause held meaning beyond immediate comprehension, yet its coherence was undeniable. The children's movements reflected inherited knowledge and foresight, the desert's shaping presence, and the unseen intelligence that had subtly guided them since the first reburials. This intelligence was impartial, yet it demanded attentiveness, humility, and respect. Each gesture carried consequence, demonstrating the quiet moral resonance of interaction across human and cosmic scales. The town, observing from the distance, now spoke in hushed tones of reverence rather than fear. The Withers children had become symbols of continuity and patience, living conduits of memory and purpose. Travelers noted the stillness of the air, the soft patterning of the sand, and the subtle illumination of celestial alignments over the graves. Even those who had once been skeptical felt the resonance of the system, a gentle teaching of care, attention, and alignment with forces older than memory. Elias's journals, now filled with meticulous observations, were no longer merely scientific records. They were testimonies of continuity, reverence, and understanding. Each ritual placement, each measured pause, and each observed gesture contributed to a silent narrative of enduring design. Knowledge and intelligence had flowed through generations, through sand, stars, and human intent, converging into a system that was both elegant and patient. He understood that the story of the Withers children was not merely about them, or even the desert, but about the intricate interplay of persistence, inheritance, and cosmic guidance that quietly shapes life across time. As twilight approached, Elias observed the children retreat once more beneath the surface. Their presence now harmonized with the desert's rhythms. He reflected on the lessons of months spent in quiet observation, that patience, attentiveness, and humility could reveal patterns otherwise imperceptible. That intelligence, whether human or emergent, thrived when aligned with enduring principles, and that the unseen, ancient forces guiding life were often gentle, patient, and profoundly instructive. The desert's hush, now complete, was not absence but resonance, a living testament to alignment, care, and enduring purpose. In the final moments of the day, Elias traced a final line in the sand, pausing to witness the silent interaction of children, land, and cosmic principle. The arcs and loops, the pauses and refinements, resonated like a quiet symphony, carrying memory, inheritance, and guidance across the still desert. The story was complete not in resolution, but in understanding, in the ongoing dialogue of intelligence and alignment that would continue long after human observation ceased. Elias rose, brushing sand from his hands, and looked toward the horizon. The desert remained infinite, patient, and watchful. The children's agency, the inherited patterns, and the guiding force persisted, a testament to quiet, eternal intelligence. In that stillness, the story closed gently, a meditation on persistence, alignment, and the enduring hush of the world, leaving a calm, reflective silence that carried the lessons of generations, intelligence, and cosmic resonance into the minds of those who would listen and drift into quiet rest.